Hello, and welcome back to the Introduction to Watercolor class, everyone. Today I'll be demonstrating how to paint an orange in watercolors. Those of you who have been following the lessons have been practicing with simple paintings of apples, eggs, paper objects, and simple shaded forms. This subject will be a little bit more complex. To increase the level of challenge and interest, I cut a slice out of this orange and arranged it into a small still life. The additional form, which is that wedge shape of the orange, the texture from both the surface of the orange skin and the flesh of the orange, and the depth from the overlapping, which is very subtle where the two objects are going to be touching, and the interplay of positive and negative space. All those things are going to make this still life a bit more visually interesting. So here's a picture of this still life setup. I arranged it so that you can both see that cutout section in the larger part of the orange, and you can also see the wedge shape. So all of this is to make it more fun to look at. If you are following along and also doing this lesson, you can either cut an orange the same way and create your own still life setup, or you can even use the photograph that I'm using here. You can take a screenshot of it and use that for your subject. So let's get started. I've got my painting board here, and I'm going to begin by taping down the edges of my paper. Now we've got to complete a contour line drawing of the subject. I'm starting on the left side of the orange. When I do that, I'm thinking about the size and location right away, and where the rest of the subject is going to be on my paper. You can start anywhere. There's not a right or wrong place to start the drawing. I try to plot some key points and angles, like the outer points of the negative shape from the orange wedge and the angle of the cut line that goes through the center of the orange. And we want this image to fill most of the paper and also be centered. After drawing the outer contours of this form, I begin to draw more interior details, like the inner edge of the white skin or rind of the orange. And some of those inner vein sort of patterns that are also from parts of the flesh of the orange. I don't want to draw too much detail though. We want to keep this simple. Most of the little details can be added later. Now I draw some of the ridges that radiate out from the center or the navel of the orange. Now I move on to the wedge shape to the right. The first thing I do is try to gauge the point where those two pieces touch or overlap. Now I estimate the angle of the top edge and that negative triangular shape between these two objects toward the bottom. While drawing, you want to check the lengths of the shapes, the vertical location, and angles of the negative shapes. This process of estimating the angles, the locations, and size of the shapes is called sight sizing. That will probably be the subject of another video. Now I'll draw some of the white veins and the orange rind. These areas are going to add some interesting patterns to the painting. Those vein patterns, I don't know what else to call them, but they sort of radiate out from the center of the top edge of this shape. Again, we don't want to go overboard with these. We want to keep it simple. It's possible to draw too much detail before painting, and that can really freeze us up and make us afraid to add any paint at all. With watercolor, it's important to work decisively and rapidly. If I want more details, I can add some later while I'm painting, but I probably won't add much more. Now I'll add a few edges of the cast shadow where they extend out from the objects, but I'm not outlining the entire cast shadow. Alright, the contour is finished. Now it's time to mix some colors and get ready to paint. When mixing your colors, try to keep two things in mind. One is to keep things simple. We're going to limit the number of colors to 4 that represent the major areas of light to dark values of the subject. The other thing to think about or keep in mind is color intensity, especially in the light and middle value areas of your subject. So the lightest color here is mostly yellow with a dab or two of orange. This is going to be used to start around the areas of pure white or highlight. The next color is yellow and orange in more equal amounts. This is going to expand outward into most of the orange. My third color is just orange. This will go in the middle value areas. These first 3 colors are very intense because I haven't mixed any cool colors with them. And when you mix a cool color with orange, it's going to neutralize the intensity. Now the last color we're going to use is orange with blue added. This is going to neutralize it and make it darker, so it's a real good shadow tone. You can see that I have more orange in this mixture than blue, and it's sort of a brown or reddish earth tone. Now let's test these colors out on a scrap piece of paper and see how they look. We have a nice range here from light to dark, so I think these will work out well. So let's get painting. We're starting with the flesh of the orange in that cutout negative shape first. I decided to start with the inside part of the orange because I plan to glaze or layer some shadows over that area later. Now we use the light yellow-orange color to carefully dab in most of the interior of the orange. But I'm leaving some tiny areas of white for the veins, the rind, and little highlights. Before we continue, let me say that there's never a perfect place to start with any artwork. It all depends on the subject and the plan of the artist. Now I didn't sketch these highlights in first, so I'm doing this now from observation. It doesn't have to be perfect either. People who see your finished painting won't be comparing it to your still life or a photo you use, so don't try to be perfect with this. I'm not leaving every highlight either, just some of the more obvious and visible highlights. It's good to keep things simple. I'm adding that light color around the edges too. I notice it's more yellowish around the edges than gets lighter toward the interior of the orange. So I want to exaggerate the lightness of that rind or skin of the orange. So I'm leaving some white and even lifting out and then softening the edge of the color around that edge. So it creates a more gradual blend. Now using that same color, we can paint the flesh of the orange wedge on the right side. Let's paint around the edge of the rind and the interior, being careful to leave white highlights and vein patterns that we see. We need some highlights on this plane or flat surface because the light is hitting it more directly than the plane or surface to the left that's in shadow. Again, there's no need to try to be perfect. We don't need to get every little detail, just the ones that really stand out. Now, it's not really dry brush that I'm using here, but for these little dabs and strokes of paint, my brush isn't loaded up with quite as much color, so it leaves more texture around the edges of the strokes. We're trying to get the randomness of these highlights too, and that irregular edge of the rind or skin so it looks natural. You see how that white rind is thin and thick in different places. Now we'll look for some darker areas and dab in the second mixture, the one that has more orange. This will give some nice color variation in those areas too. By adding this little bit darker and more orange color right at the edge beside those white areas, it will make them stand out. Now it's time to soften the edge of the color that we added along the white rind. There are some little points of darker color I see along that edge, so I'll add those in too. Back in that other section we painted earlier, I noticed an area of highlight that I want to lift out. So I'll use my brush to soak some of that out. That looks pretty good to me, so I'll dry that with the heat gun. A hair dryer works just as well for this. We're running out of color here, so I'm going to take some time to mix more. Now let's paint the outside of the orange. We'll take the lightest color and dab it around the highlight or little highlights. I'm using a broken pattern to show that texture of the orange skin. You might even want to practice this on a piece of scrap paper before working on your painting. Now we'll fill in more area as we move away from the highlight. Now let's use our darker color that has more orange in the mixture and dab it into the middle of the orange. The very outer edge, and most of the shadow side of that orange. In those spaces we left, we'll dab in the pure orange and let it bleed into the other color. Also, I'm going to dab some of this into those ridges that travel out from the center. I also see a couple darker places around that I want to emphasize as well, so I'll dot those in. Now it's time to paint our form shadows and the core of the shadow. While it's wet, we can dab in our darkest color in the area of that core shadow. We'll also add that same color for some of the shadows from the ridges that are around the bottom of the orange. We'll take this time while it's still wet to add some of the lighter, more intense colors in areas. Now we'll add and drag some of this orange into that orange wedge off to the right. I'm going to mix more of my dark color, plus I'm going to add just a little more blue in it to make it darker. Now let's add that into that dark shadow area where the two objects are touching. We can take some yellow orange and add it into the texture in that shadow side of the wedge and some other places where it should be darker. Here we're just using our yellow-orange color to emphasize some of the darker spots of texture. When adding these darker details, it's just about personal preference and observation. On your painting, you might decide to add more texture, less texture, or maybe you'll see different areas of texture that you need to add. That's up to you. Let's add some of that darkest color to the stem or the navel of the orange. And we'll stop here and dry this off a little bit with the heat gun. Now we're going to work on that shadow area in the wedge. I want to keep my two lighter colors, but I'll clean off the rest of the palette to mix some new shadow colors. I'm going to be using blue and orange again. This is a great combination for glazing shadows and mixing neutral colors. I'm not going to completely mix the orange and the blue together though. Notice how I'm keeping them kind of pure on either end of this puddle. That's because there's places that I want to use more blue and places I want to use more orange. Let's start by glazing the blue over the shadow area where the wedge was cut out. And I'm going to hit that area that's really around the rind or the skin of the orange. While that's still wet, we'll add in more of the orange color and then let those bleed together. I'm exaggerating the color a little bit here, but the cool blue will mimic the shadow that's cast across the white rind, and the warmer color will act as a shadow in those fleshy parts of the orange. While this is wet, we can add some darker details. We can also lift out lighter areas. I'm going to lift out some of that blue where I got it a little bit too dark. You can see how the cool blue color really shows the difference between the rind and the flesh of the orange. Now let's add this same color combination in the shadowy corner of the orange wedge off to the right. We'll add more water and soften and blend it away from the shadow. I also see a few bluish shadows I can add along the top. That makes it stand out from the white background. Now let's add more yellow-orange to create some darker details, especially along the rind to create some contrast on that edge. Okay, now let's dry that off with the heat gun. What we're going to do now is mix more dark orange and pure orange colors to add into the shadow side of that cutout section of orange. We'll dab in some orange, and I'm going to leave a few spaces to show the lighter vein patterns. I see a little yellow in places too that I'll add in. Now there are a few really dark places in there, so we'll mix a dark, warm, neutral color and add those in. While this color is on the brush, we might as well add some dark areas on the bottom of the orange too. We'll soften those using our lighter yellow-orange color. Alright, let's put in some cast shadows. I'll clean off the bottom of my palette and mix 3 colors. The top is mostly blue with a little brown added. This will make a great shadow color. The next is darker with less water and more equal amounts of blue and brown. This will make a nice dark gray. The last color will be our darkest. It's just black with more pigment and less water. Let's test these out to see how they look. Those of you who've been following the previous lessons will see this isn't really different than the cast shadows we've painted before. We'll start with our middle value color right up next to the objects. And we'll carefully paint along the edge. The shadows of these two objects connect. So we'll use the same color to fill in part of the cast shadow on the orange wedge. Now let's take the lightest cast shadow color and dab into the outer part of the cast shadow for the main part of the orange and connect it to the second cast shadow and extend it out to the right a little more. While this is still wet, we need to soften the outer edges of both shadows. I made a little mistake there. I'll have to fix that up later. Now this still hasn't dried yet, so while it's wet, we'll get some of the black and dab it in at the base of the orange. Between both objects and at the base of the orange wedge. Now that can bleed and blend into those other colors. I'm going to make a few little adjustments here. I'm going to soften some edges of the cast shadow. And I'll soften the bottom right edge of the orange that's in shadow. Also, I want to get some orange and add it to the right edge of that wedge shape, just to create more color and value contrast. So I don't know if you noticed, but when I was painting the shadows, I had some paint on my hand and accidentally smudged my painting. I thought about redoing or repainting this demonstration, but then I decided it makes more sense to show you how to fix mistakes like this since we all make them. You could see those nasty looking smudges there. In this case, I figured it's best to let them totally dry and then erase them using sandpaper. This is about 220 grit. I fold it up into a small square and very gradually take my time and sand away the dry smudges. It has to be completely dry. So let it totally dry and then be patient and gradually sand it away with a light touch. That smudge right along the cast shadow is a little tricky. I'm able to lighten that so it blends better with the rest of the shadow. It's not perfect, but it looks pretty good to me, so I'll leave well enough alone. So that's one way to correct some mistakes or splatters, especially on white paper or a white background. Here's the finished painting. The vivid color, texture, the variety of shapes and overlapping forms, and the shadows make it a little more challenging than other paintings we've done up to this point. I hope you all have much success when you try this, but if you make mistakes or things go wrong, try not to let it get to you and try it again. That's really the purpose here. These are small, quick paintings for practice. That's all for this lesson. I hope you enjoyed it and gained something that you can use in your paintings. See you next time, and thanks for watching.